far as I'm concerned, arid deserts like this one have got to be the most difficult places on Earth to survive of all. And that's because of two things: daytime temperatures that soar into the high 50s and an almost complete lack of water. If you come here, you literally have to bring with you everything that you're going to need. And if you break down, you're in the nightmare scenario of only really being able to eke those supplies out for as long as possible, in the hope that someone may come along and rescue you.
Desert covers a fifth of the Earth's surface, and of all the deserts, the Sahara is by far the biggest. You could fit the whole of Europe in and still have room to spare. And it's a tough place to survive, with temperatures hitting 50 degrees centigrade and some parts that haven't seen rain for years.
In such a difficult place, you might well ask the question, why come here in the first instance? Well, the answer to that is quite simple. The desert is one of the most beautiful and stunning places on Earth. And the solitude here, well, that's poetic.
But during the Second World War, many young men, like the crew of this American bomber, the Lady Be Good, found themselves in this hostile land with very little hope of survival. In 1943, pilot William Hatton and his crew of 8 young Americans took off from their base in Libya on a bombing mission. They never returned. 16 years later, in 1959, an oil prospector came across the wreck of the plane. It contained food and water. There was even a thermos of coffee and a radio, but no sign of the crew. In the dark, they'd overshot their base, flying on until they got hopelessly lost and ran out of fuel. Believing they were over the sea, they'd bailed out with virtually nothing, abandoning the plane, which crash-landed without them.
The bodies of the crew weren't found until a year after the wreckage of the plane was discovered, a full 17 years after they bailed out. With the bodies was a diary that charts their last days. It makes for a compelling but haunting read. Monday the 5th of April. Start walking northwest.
A few rations. Half canteen of water. 1 capful per day. Sun fairly warm. Good breeze from northwest. Night very cold. No sleep. Rested and walked.
Half a canteen was nowhere near enough water for the journey they were undertaking. You can survive for weeks without food, but in the desert, without water, it's just a matter of days.
Tuesday. Rested at 11:30. Sun very warm. No breeze. Spent PM in hell. Walked and rested all night. 15 minutes on, 5 off.
As the crew made their way through the desert, they left arrows made from rocks and strips of parachute. It was the right thing to do, even though no one would see them for nearly 2 decades. Wednesday. Everyone getting weak.
Can't get very far. Prayers all the time.
The crew thought they'd crashed near the coast, and it was probably that kept them going for as long as they did. In fact, they were in an area known as the Sand Sea of Calancio, a place so dry that not even the desert Bedouins entered it. Thursday, hit sand dunes.
Very miserable. Lamott's eyes are gone. Everyone else's eyes are bad. Still going northwest.
They were probably suffering from sand blindness, a condition very similar to snow blindness caused by the glare of the bright sunshine from the white sand.
Saturday. No sign of anything. Really weak now. Can't walk. Pains all over. Still, I'll want to die.
And the final entry says simply, Monday the 12th. No help yet. Very cold night. They'd survived for 8 days, having covered an unbelievable 70 miles, enduring 130-degree heat. But when their bodies were found, they were still 400 miles from the Mediterranean.
they never had a chance. The tragic tale of William Hatton and his crew is an incredible story of endurance, but it's also a salutary one. The Lady Be Good is as big as 4 buses, and there was no trace of it for 16 years.
So how do you rate your chances of being spotted in one of these? Because today, this is the most common way that you'll find your way into a desert in a 4x4. A vehicle like this is your most important piece of equipment because not only is it your transport out of here, but it also carries all of your basic life support. Whenever you enter any desert, there are a few simple preparations you can make that will dramatically increase your chances of survival. For a start, if you can possibly avoid it, never travel alone. Terrain like this is incredibly tough on vehicles, and the most common cause of people perishing in the desert is after a breakdown. So we're travelling in 2 vehicles, one for me and one for the crew. Theirs is the one with air conditioning.
There's no doubt desert travel is immensely rewarding, but when you head out into the dunes, don't think you're Lawrence of Arabia. Use the best equipment. Plan your route. Let someone know where you're going and when you're coming back. Once you've made a plan, stick to it. Leave your route and you're as good as signing your own death warrant, because this is a very small needle in a 3 million square mile haystack.
Above all else though, it's the vehicle that needs the most preparation. And that's not something to do on the spur of the moment. It needs careful forethought. To give you some idea, this is my kit list for just this sort of expedition. Now all experienced off-road drivers have a pre-prepared list of mechanical items that they're going to check on a daily basis. But if you haven't got a list, then there's an easy way to remember it, and that's P, petrol, E, electricity, T, tyres, R, radiator, O, oil, L, lights. And of course the last thing you want in the desert is a vehicle fire, so always carry your spare fuel in metal jerry cans. Plastic ones just aren't up to the job. It's interesting that they get their name from the Second World War, when the German army had these superior pressed steel cans, while the British army just had cheap tin ones which tended to split. Ever since then, these have been called jerry cans. One thing you must never take for granted or underestimate is the amount of water you're going to need. There's about 40 litres there. Now that may seem a lot, but that's actually only enough to keep me going for about 2 days, considering all of my needs. Too many people come out to the desert and bob around in their 4x4s as though they're in the Paris to Dakar rally. Driving off-road requires patience, concentration, and a few simple driving techniques. One important tip is to keep your thumbs out of the wheel, because if you hit a rock and the wheel turns suddenly, the bar can be thrown around and break them. Driving in sand, you want to get into the higher gears, pull away in second and try to get into third quickly, but you have to build up momentum. If you put the clutch in and you're not going fast enough, you simply stop. What you want to do is just float across the top of it. Well, if you drive long enough off-road, you're inevitably going to get stuck. It's normal. It's all part of the game, and it's no drama. It's not such a difficult thing to get out. I could just lower the tyre pressures here and pull straight out, but these vehicles are really well equipped. We don't need to go through the hassle of letting the tyres down and re-inflating them. There's another way. The really good news is that the differential here isn't touching the sand. If that was, then the weight of the vehicle is supported by it, and it would be a much bigger job of digging. So what I think I'll do is just remove the sand that's impeding the progress of the rear wheels. And be out of here real quick. These are sand mats or sand ladders, whatever you want to call them. And they're excellent because they basically give you a road surface to drive on in soft sand. Of course, I don't want to stop too quickly once I get out of the sand, so there's one last trick. So I bring these with me. Now, if there's one place you don't want anybody to stand when you're using these mats, it's right behind the vehicle, because they can be thrown out by the wheels at high speed. I once saw that happen in Zaire. A man was standing here, the vehicle moved forward, the sand mats came back and hit him across the shins, cutting him to the bone. Well, there you go. The vehicle's on hard ground and the sand mats are with me. I don't have to go back for them. And of course, efficiency is a basic principle when you're out in the outback.
Deserts are such extreme places that they've produced many tales of endurance and survival, from the earliest travellers right up to the present day. Like the story of Robert Martin, a young German who was working for an oil company in the desert in Oman.
New Year's Eve 1998 was supposed to be Robert Martin's last night in the desert before leaving Oman. He spent it camping with a colleague, but on their way back they got bogged in soft sand.
Robert knew how to get himself out and used an air jack to get the car free. By plugging onto the exhaust, it lets the car do the work of digging itself out. But in his haste, he made a mistake.
I put the air jack under the tank, and that must have caused the fuel pump, which was inside the tank, to break off its fixings.
He got the vehicle out, but the damage to the fuel pump had already been done.
On the rattling road afterwards, it must have got disconnected, and that's why the vehicle stopped. I only know this by now. Then I didn't know, otherwise I could have solved the problem maybe, but yeah, that's why the vehicle stopped. We tried to start it again, were not very successful, so we decided, as it was late in the afternoon already, to stay overnight and try it the next morning.
Robert was trained in desert survival, so even though he and his friend Regina were only a few miles from the nearest village, he knew their best chance of survival was to stay with the vehicle. He'd left details of his route with friends and was confident that they would raise the alarm within 3 days.
We counted the amount of food and water we had and calculated how much time it would take a search party approximately to find us. And our calculation was, latest after 3 days they would start searching for us, and it would take the search party approximately 3 days to find us. And by just remembering this calculation, we didn't lose hope.
Confident of being found, they made cards and board games to pass the time. But days passed slowly with little food and no sign of anyone.
We were expecting somebody to pass by, but nobody at all was passing by or even seen in the distance. It was absolutely a deserted area.
Soon they'd run out of things to say to each other, and as the wait stretched out, the walk to the village must have been ever more appealing.
We were tempted in the beginning, but it was a decision we made right in the beginning. We said, we stay. That's what I always was told, and that's what everybody will expect from me. And it paid back that we stayed with the vehicle, because a colleague of mine was asked, will I be staying with the vehicle? And he said, yeah, he's German. He was told to stay with the vehicle, he will stay.
Sure that a search would be underway, Robert and Regina collected firewood in preparation for a signal fire. On the fourth day, they finally heard their first helicopter.
We saw the helicopter a couple of times, and we were always surprised why they didn't see us.
The smoke from their fire was too thin to be seen.
One day they came close, about 500 meters, and we were surprised why they were just leaving.
It wasn't until they lit a tyre from the car that the helicopter finally spotted them. It was only then, after 8 days in the desert, that they were rescued, and they could see why it had taken so long for the helicopter to find them.
After we were picked up by the helicopter, and we were looking down from just 200 meters, we couldn't see the car anymore. So, very difficult for a helicopter to find.
Robert did everything right, but it still took a week to find him. One more day, and he reckons he'd have had to set off on foot. And if that happened, his chances of being found would have been virtually nil.
If you do break down, you've no idea how long you're going to be stuck, so assume the worst. Out here, every decision is life or death, so stick to the rules.
The first rule of desert survival is always stay with your vehicle. And the second rule, get in the shade.
I always carry a parachute with me because they're ideal for creating shelter. And that's another reason why you should always stay with your vehicle. It's not just the most visible thing you've got, it's a huge emergency kit.
Right, that's the shade arranged. What I've done is I've taken the parachute and I've doubled it to create this airspace here. That helps to make very effective insulation from the sun's rays. But of course the sand is incredibly hot, so what I need to arrange now is something to sit on. The great thing about Land Rovers is you can easily lift out the seats, just what I need. Well, that's great. Now I'm comfortable. And the important thing about having shade is that it enables me to think clearly. If you're trying to make important decisions about survival under the baking heat of the sun, it's very difficult to make the right ones.
So stay calm, keep your mouth shut and roll your sleeves down. You've got to do everything to conserve moisture.
And when it comes to water, you have to be sensible. You don't want to over-ration it, because it's no good in here. It's got to be inside you if it's going to help you. So don't waste it, but do drink.
To see just how much water you need in desert temperatures, we asked our researcher Matt to do some real research. We put him in a sauna for 4 hours with plenty of water to see how much he needs to sweat in order to maintain an even body temperature.
There are approximately 2 million sweat glands throughout the body, and basically what they're doing is they're secreting a layer of water and electrolytes and other substances which spreads along the surface of the body and then evaporates, and it's that process of evaporation which is removing heat from the body. If it didn't do that, then your body temperature would rise from 37 degrees centigrade to 43, 44 in a matter of an hour.
By which time Matt would be very dead.
Well, Matt is actually very comfortable. He has been in the sauna for some time now. He's sweating approximately 700 grams of sweat an hour. That's equivalent to a pint and a half an hour, and he needs to replace that volume of fluid if he's not to become dehydrated.
Matt's drunk 6 pints in 4 hours. That's very good, but he's having to make a conscious effort to keep drinking.
Thirst is a very poor indicator of fluid requirements. What tends to happen is people dehydrate by 1 to 2% of their body weight before thirst is triggered. So you shouldn't rely just on thirst in order to maintain your water balance.
Stuck in the desert, with your water running out, you need to make sure you're doing everything you can to help people searching for you. Now the sun's going down, I can start to make a sign that can be seen from the air. This V shape is internationally recognised as a distress signal, but you want to be seen day and night.
I'm collecting some firewood so that I can make a couple of signal fires, in fact 3, because in an emergency you do everything in 3s if you can. Got to be careful when doing this, keep my eyes open for scorpions. The last thing I want now is to be stung.
No rubbing sticks together now. Use what you've got, and the vehicle's fuel will save a lot of effort in my attempt to attract rescue. Now all I've got to do is wait for nightfall.
It gets real cold in the desert at night. That's when one of these Arab jello bars comes in really useful. Feel like Obi-Wan Kenobi.
If you're stuck out here, you're bound to wonder if you could make it out on foot. After all, every day that passes is time running out.
So the temptation to get up and go will be huge, but you must resist.
But part of me has always wondered how far I'd get, and now I'm about to find out.
If you haven't got a hat with you, it's vital that you improvise some sort of shade for your head. And for that I've bought this piece of parachute nylon with which I can easily make an Arab-style headdress. I'll take that knot, place it at the back of my head, and gather the fabric, and then just wrap that around and tuck it in. Just tuck the rest into my shirt at the back. A pair of raised sunbands. Perfect if I ever make it back to the King's Road.
But none of this is really going to help me here. I'd be lucky to last more than a couple of days.
Walking out of a desert requires an incredible amount of determination, resourcefulness, and most importantly, luck. As much luck as Bob Nelson had after he was shot down over the desert in 1942.
Bob managed to grab a few supplies before his plane blew up. Some tins of tomato juice, serve cool, a water bottle, torch, and compass were all useful, as was Benzedrine, an amphetamine provided to keep him going with little food or sleep. But his crepe-soled desert boots weren't really up to the journey ahead.
For 7 days, the only living things he saw were flies. During the heat of the day, he rested, walking only at night, signalling forlornly with his torch to try and attract aircraft.
He drank a tin of tomato juice and a little water each day, but pretty soon his liquid had run out. In desperation, he took all the Benzedrine and walked through the heat of the day. It was a desperate thing to do, and eventually he passed out.
He came to beside some telegraph poles, thinking that if he broke the line, it would attract attention. He cut several down, but even then no one came.
However, the empty petrol tins he found at the foot of the poles probably saved his life. With great resourcefulness, he cut them open. In the morning, condensation had left drops of water on the metal. Licking these was just enough to keep him alive, but after 3 days in the desert, time was running out. Then he had a stroke of luck. He spotted a camel train, which would prove to be his lifeline. A nomad with the camels gave Bob his first proper drink for days. As soon as the liquid hit his stomach, Bob suffered cramps, but he couldn't have survived without this assistance. The nomads looked after Bob and helped him recuperate. After a few days, fully stocked with water and with good directions, he set off alone into the desert once more. Don't forget, this was the middle of the war, so all the time Bob was trying to evade capture and return to Allied lines. Along the way, he came across the burned-out wrecks of vehicles and crashed aircraft, from which he took vital supplies. Eventually, after 18 days in the desert, Bob reached the German front line, which he simply walked through in broad daylight. But no man's land was a different matter. It was here that Bob's luck finally ran out. He was captured that night, just 1 mile from his own lines. But Bob Nelson's extraordinary story didn't end there. 2 years later, he was one of the prisoners who took part in the breakout that became famous as the Great Escape. He was one of the few recaptured not to be shot. Maybe the Gestapo thought that he was related to his illustrious namesake, Admiral Nelson. Unlike Bob, most of us need rescuing to be able to return safely to food, shelter, and most importantly, a cold drink. 1 beer, barman, please. Sadly, Bob died in 1999. He was one of the very few people who've ever walked out of a desert and survived. How did you get here? I'll tell you sometime, but where's my beer? Buy your own beer. So why'd you walk? You know you're supposed to stay with your vehicle. Well, it looked like a really nice walk. Couldn't resist it. You're crazy. No, I'm not. Yes, you are. Next week, the chills and thrills of the subarctic forest.